Here's what nobody saw coming in January 2025. The same America that was threatening India with sanctions just 6 months ago is now begging New Delhi for a strategic partnership. The same administration that called India's energy policies reckless and destabilizing is now praising Modi as a visionary leader. The same Washington establishment that froze diplomatic talks is now rolling out the red carpet for Indian delegates. What happened? How did India flip the script so dramatically that it went from being America's problem to America's solution? And more importantly, what does this tell us about the seismic shift happening in global power right now? This isn't just another trade spat that got resolved. This is the story of how a rising power learned to play the great game better than the established players. This is how India turned American pressure into Indian leverage. And this is why the old rules of international relations are dead. The conflict set up. When America declared war on India's independence, let's rewind to mid-2024. The world looked very different then. America was still operating under the assumption that it could dictate terms to any country, including India. The Biden administration had just imposed a fresh round of sanctions on Indian energy companies for buying Russian oil. Secretary of State Antony Blinken publicly criticized India's neutrality on Ukraine, calling it morally questionable. The pressure campaign was relentless. Washington froze $12 billion in promised infrastructure funding. American tech companies were quietly advised to reconsider their Indian expansion plans. The U.S. ambassador to India was recalled for consultations. Diplomatic speak for "we're really angry with you." But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of backing down, India doubled down. Prime Minister Modi didn't just continue buying Russian oil, he expanded the partnership. India signed a 20-year energy deal with Moscow worth $80 billion. Indian refineries started processing more Russian crude than ever before, selling refined products to Europe at a premium. The American establishment was furious. Think tank experts appeared on CNN calling India an unreliable partner. Congressional hearings questioned whether India deserved its strategic partner status. The narrative was clear. India needed to choose sides, and if it didn't choose America, there would be consequences. The turning point. When the hunter became the hunted, then something extraordinary happened in October 2024. China made a move that changed everything. Beijing announced the Asian Infrastructure Alliance, a massive economic bloc that included Russia, Iran, and crucially, an open invitation to India. The proposed alliance would create the world's largest energy trading network, bypassing the dollar entirely. It would include joint development of Arctic shipping routes, shared satellite technology, and coordinated defense procurement. Suddenly, Washington realized they had a problem. A big problem. If India joined this alliance, America wouldn't just lose influence in South Asia, it would lose its grip on the entire Indo-Pacific strategy. The Quad would collapse overnight. The containment of China policy would become a joke. Worse yet, America's European allies were already quietly exploring trade deals with this new bloc. The phone calls from Washington to New Delhi went from threatening to pleading in a matter of weeks. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was on a plane to India within 72 hours of the Chinese announcement. The sanctions were under review. The frozen infrastructure funding was suddenly available for immediate disbursement. But India wasn't done playing its hand. Deep dive. The anatomy of American miscalculation to understand how America got it so wrong. We need to look at the numbers that Washington chose to ignore. India wasn't just another developing country that could be pushed around. By 2024, India had become the world's fifth largest economy, with a GDP of $4.02 trillion. More importantly, it was the fastest growing major economy, expanding at 7.8% annually, while America struggled with 2.1% growth. The demographic story was even more striking. India's median age was 28. Compared to America's 38 and China's 39. Every month, 1.2 million Indians turned 18, a workforce addition larger than the entire population of many European countries. This wasn't just numbers. This was the future of global labor and consumption. But the real miscalculation was in energy geopolitics. When America sanctioned Indian energy companies, they assumed India would cave because it needed Western technology and financing. What they didn't realize was that India had spent the previous decade building exactly the infrastructure needed to operate independently. Indian Oil Corporation had developed indigenous refining technology that could process heavy Russian crude more efficiently than traditional Western refineries. Reliance Industries had built the world's largest integrated refinery complex. Most crucially, India had established direct payment systems with Russia that completely bypassed Western banking networks. The result? When America imposed sanctions, India's energy cost actually decreased. Russian oil was selling at a 30% discount to Brent crude. Indian refineries were processing this cheap oil and selling refined products to Europe at market prices. India wasn't just surviving American pressure, it was profiting from it. The trade numbers tell the story. In 2023, before the sanctions escalated, India-Russia trade was $65 billion. By late 2024, it had crossed $95 billion. Meanwhile, U.S. India trade had stagnated at $191 billion, with American companies losing market share to Chinese and European competitors who were less concerned about Washington's political demands. Global context, the multipolar moment. But this story isn't just about India and America. It's about a fundamental shift in how global power works. China was watching India's resistance with great interest. Beijing realized that if India could successfully defy American economic pressure, then China's own vulnerable sectors, technology, finance, energy, might have more room to maneuver than previously thought. Russia, despite being under the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history, was finding new pathways to global markets through India. Moscow wasn't just selling oil to New Delhi. It was using India as a hub for reaching markets across Asia and Africa. Putin called this the Eastern Economic Corridor, a new trade route that bypassed Western financial systems entirely. Europe found itself in an impossible position, publicly supporting American sanctions while quietly depending on Indian refined Russian energy products. German manufacturers were increasingly sourcing components from Indian suppliers who could offer competitive prices precisely because they had access to cheap Russian energy. The hypocrisy was becoming impossible to maintain. The BRICS summit in Kazan in October 2024 crystallized these new realities. When Modi spoke about strategic autonomy and multipolarity, he wasn't just making diplomatic statements. He was articulating the new rules of international relations. Countries would no longer accept binary choices between great powers. The era of "you're either with us or against us" was over. Even traditional American allies were taking notes. South Korea quietly expanded its trade with Russia through Indian intermediaries. Japan began exploring creative interpretations of sanctions that would allow continued economic cooperation with countries under American pressure. The message was clear. If India could maintain its independence, maybe others could too. India's leverage, the unexpected superpower. So how did India accumulate this leverage that caught Washington off guard? First, geography. India sits at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Any global trade route, whether maritime or digital, has to account for India's position. When China proposed the Belt and Road Initiative, they needed Indian cooperation to make it work. When America designed the Indo-Pacific strategy, India was essential. When Russia wanted to reach global markets, India was the gateway. Second, demography. India's population had just crossed 1.4 billion, making it the world's most populous country. But unlike China's aging population, India's demographic dividend was just beginning. Every global company from Apple to Tesla to Google needed access to Indian consumers and workers. Threatening that access was like threatening the future of global business. Third, technology. India had quietly become indispensable to the global digital economy. Indian engineers were running critical systems for American tech giants. Indian software was powering European banks. Indian satellites were providing data for global climate monitoring. Cutting India out of technology networks would damage the cutters as much as the cut. Fourth, energy transformation. India wasn't just buying Russian oil, it was becoming a global energy hub. Indian refineries were processing crude from multiple sources and distributing products across Asia and Africa. Indian renewable energy companies were leading global solar deployment. India's energy choices were increasingly determining global energy prices. Fifth, diplomatic balancing. India had mastered the art of strategic relationships without strategic dependence. New Delhi maintained strong ties with Washington while deepening partnership with Moscow. It competed with China while cooperating on climate change. It led the global south while engaging the developed world. This wasn't fence-sitting, it was sophisticated power balancing. The financial numbers revealed India's growing autonomy. Foreign exchange reserves had crossed $700 billion, enough to weather any external shock. The rupee-ruble trade mechanism was processing $40 billion annually, without involving Western currencies. Indian companies were raising capital in Asian markets rather than New York or London. Economic independence was becoming financial reality. Strategic advice. India's next moves given this position of strength. What should India do next? Here are the critical strategic imperatives. First, institutionalize strategic autonomy. India needs to build permanent institutions that can maintain its independent foreign policy regardless of which party is in power in Washington, Beijing, or Moscow. This means creating alternative financial systems, diversified supply chains, and redundant diplomatic networks. The goal isn't to oppose any particular country, but to ensure that no single country can dictate India's choices. Second, lead the Global South Coalition. India is uniquely positioned to lead developing countries in creating new international institutions. The G20 presidency was just the beginning. India should propose new mechanisms for South-South trade, technology transfer, and climate cooperation that don't depend on Western approval. If India can unite 150 developing countries around common economic interests, no global power can ignore this coalition. Third, accelerate technological independence. The semiconductor shortage revealed how vulnerable all countries are to supply chain disruptions. India needs to accelerate domestic production of critical technologies, semiconductors, batteries, solar panels, telecommunications equipment. This isn't about autarky. It's about having alternatives when others try to use technology as a weapon. Fourth, expand energy hub strategy. India should leverage its refining capacity and geographical position to become the energy hub for Asia and Africa. This means building more pipelines, storage facilities, and distribution networks. It also means leading the global transition to renewable energy by making clean technology affordable for developing countries. Fifth, master economic statecraft. India needs to get better at using economic tools for strategic purposes. This means coordinated trade policies, strategic use of its massive consumer market, and leveraging Indian diaspora networks for economic diplomacy. If America can weaponize the dollar, India can weaponize its growth story. Sixth, build military-industrial capacity. Strategic autonomy ultimately depends on the ability to defend yourself. India needs to accelerate defense production, reduce dependence on foreign weapon systems, and develop indigenous capabilities in emerging domains like space, cyber, and artificial intelligence. The goal isn't to threaten anyone. It's to ensure that no one can threaten India. The key insight is that India's leverage comes from being indispensable, not from being confrontational. Every strategy should focus on making India more valuable to more countries, not on making enemies of existing powers. Historical lens. The death of hegemonic order. What we're witnessing isn't just another diplomatic crisis that got resolved. We're seeing the end of the unipolar moment and the birth of a truly multipolar world. For 30 years after the Cold War, America operated under the assumption that it could shape global order through a combination of military power, economic incentives, and institutional control. Countries had to choose, align with America and prosper, or resist and face isolation. India's successful defiance of American pressure represents the breakdown of this system. When a country can resist American economic coercion and actually benefit from it, the entire logic of hegemonic control collapses. This isn't the first time this has happened in history. The British Empire faced similar challenges in the early 20th century, when rising powers like Germany and America refused to accept British dominance. The difference is that today's multipolar order isn't emerging through military conflict, but through economic competition and technological innovation. China's rise created the possibility of an alternative to American leadership. Russia's resistance demonstrated that even comprehensive sanctions couldn't force a major power into submission. But it was India's emergence that proved the new rules of the game. India showed that countries could benefit from great power competition rather than being victims of it. India demonstrated that strategic autonomy wasn't just possible, but profitable. India proved that the global South didn't have to choose between East and West. It could create its own path. The implications are staggering. If India can maintain its independence while growing at 7% annually, why should any country accept external constraints on its development? If India can trade with Russia despite American sanctions, why should any country fear economic pressure? If India can lead international institutions while maintaining diverse partnerships, why should any country accept junior partner status? American policymakers are beginning to understand this new reality. The phone calls to Modi aren't just about resolving immediate tensions. They're about figuring out how America can maintain influence in a world where it can no longer dictate terms. The European Union is having similar conversations. Brexit was supposed to demonstrate the costs of leaving Western institutions. Instead, it's become a model for how countries can maintain economic prosperity while asserting political independence. Even China is adjusting its strategy. Beijing initially saw India's resistance to American pressure as an opportunity to pull New Delhi into a China-led bloc. But India's refusal to choose sides has forced China to accept partnership rather than dominance as the basis for Asian cooperation. The climax: power shift in real time. We're not just analyzing historical trends. We're watching a power transition happen in real time. Every week brings new evidence of this shift. American companies are quietly dropping political conditions from their Indian investment plans. European leaders are making pilgrimages to New Delhi to discuss strategic partnerships that have nothing to do with American approval. African and Latin American countries are studying the India model of strategic autonomy. The January 2025 phone call between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi wasn't just about resolving bilateral tensions. It was about America accepting the new rules of international relations. When Trump praised India's strong leadership and independent decision-making, he was acknowledging that America no longer expected other countries to follow American preferences automatically. But the story is far from over. Power transitions are messy, unpredictable, and full of reversals. America still has enormous advantages: military power, financial networks, technological leadership, and alliance systems. China is still rising and still challenging American dominance. Russia is still disruptive and still capable of causing global chaos. India's success in 2024 doesn't guarantee continued success in 2025 and beyond. Maintaining strategic autonomy requires constant recalibration, continuous innovation, and careful management of competing pressures. One miscalculation could undermine years of careful diplomacy. The real test will come when India faces its next major crisis. Will the institutions and relationships built during this period of success prove durable under pressure? Will India's partners respect its autonomy when their own interests are at stake? Will India's domestic political system support the long-term strategic thinking that got it to this position? The conclusion: the question that defines our future. Here's what makes this moment so significant. We're not just watching India's rise. We're watching the emergence of a new model of international relations based on strategic autonomy rather than alliance dependence. The old question was, which great power will dominate the 21st century? The new question is, can countries maintain their independence while participating in global systems of cooperation and competition? India's story suggests the answer is yes. But India's story also suggests that success requires sophisticated strategy, patient execution, and the courage to resist pressure from all directions. The implications extend far beyond South Asia. If smaller and medium powers can successfully maintain their autonomy while engaging with all major powers, then the international system becomes much more complex, much more competitive, and potentially much more stable. But there's a darker possibility. If strategic autonomy becomes the norm, if every country refuses to accept leadership from any other country, then global cooperation on critical issues, climate change, pandemic response, nuclear proliferation becomes much more difficult. The American reset with India isn't just about resolving bilateral tensions. It's about testing whether the emerging multipolar order can produce cooperation or whether it will produce chaos. So here's the question that will define the next decade of international relations. Is India's successful resistance to American pressure the beginning of a more balanced and stable world order? Or is it the beginning of a more fragmented and dangerous world, where no country can provide the leadership necessary to address global challenges? The answer will determine not just India's future, but the future of international cooperation itself. And right now, that future is being written in the decisions made in New Delhi, Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. What do you think? Is this a genuine reset toward a more balanced world, or just tactical maneuvering before the next round of great power competition begins?